headlights died, and the silence swallowed the sound instantly. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was a physical pressure, deep and cold. Adam cut the engine, and the four men sat for a heavy moment in the suffocating darkness of the cabin. They were 7 hours north of the city, deep within the Blackwood National Forest, and the time was just past midnight. The air was a sharp, biting cold, carrying the damp, mineral scent of ancient earth. "All right, boys, welcome to the middle of nowhere," Charlie announced, his voice booming a little too loudly in the confined space, a nervous tick Adam immediately registered. Charlie was the organizer, the one who insisted on getting away from it all every year. This year, all felt particularly far away. Adam, practical as ever, began unloading the heavy Pelican cases of gear. He liked the woods, but this location, chosen somewhat arbitrarily by Leo, felt wrong. The trees were too close, too tall, their black mass absorbing the weak starlight. Leo, lean and restless, was already out of the truck, stretching. Perfect, absolutely perfect isolation. "Jake, you ready for a quick perimeter check? I want to see how far the ridge goes before we tie ourselves down for the night." Jake, the quietest of the group and the one most susceptible to suggestion, zipped up his thick jacket. "Sure, keep it fast though, it's freezing." Adam pulled a heavy axe and a coil of rope from the truck bed. "Hold on, Leo, we just got here. Let's set up the fire ring and the bear cache first. Don't go deep." "Relax, Phixer," Leo said, slapping Adam lightly on the shoulder. "We'll be 20 minutes, tops. We're just stretching our legs before the heavy lifting. You and Charlie secure the immediate zone, get the tent sorted. Jake needs the exercise." The decision was impulsive and unnecessary, exactly the kind of move Adam instinctively disliked. But the mood was still light, bordering on jovial, and he wasn't going to start the trip with a fight. Charlie clapped his hands together, forcing a cheerfulness that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Right then, split the difference. Adam, you and I handle the camp boundaries and fire pit. Leo, Jake, don't trip over anything you can't outrun. We'll have a fire going by the time you're back." Adam watched as Leo and Jake grabbed a single flashlight and disappeared silently between the dense black columns of the pines. Their laughter, a sharp, quick sound, vanished almost instantly, swallowed by the forest. A profound, unnatural cold settled over the small clearing, deeper than the external temperature warranted. Adam shivered, despite his thick flannel and thermal vest. He looked at Charlie, whose forced smile had finally dissolved. "That felt cold, didn't it?" Charlie mumbled, looking at the place where the light had disappeared. "It's November, Charlie," Adam said, forcing practicality. But he knew Charlie wasn't talking about the weather. He picked up the axe. "Let's get the fire going." Leo and Jake pushed further into the woods than they intended, following a barely visible game trail. The excitement that had propelled them earlier had curdled into a tight, anxious silence. The cold here felt absolute, the air so still that their hurried footsteps on the pine needles sounded deafeningly loud. "We should turn back," Jake whispered, his breath clouding heavily in the darkness. "It's too quiet. We promised Adam 20 minutes. "Just 5 more, Leo insisted, his flashlight swinging wildly. He felt an intense, irrational pull forward, a desire to break the suffocating uniformity of the pines. He was right. Moments later, the dense growth gave way to a small, choked clearing. Centered within it was a cabin. It was small, old, and violently dilapidated, the roof sagging, the windows shattered and boarded over with rough, dark planks. It should have been a ruin, dead and abandoned, but it wasn't. Against the black silhouette of the structure, a thin, wavering column of smoke was clearly rising from the cracked stone chimney. "Someone's here," Jake breathed, his voice laced with relief and confusion. "Maybe an old park ranger." Leo immediately quieted him. The sight of the smoke made no logical sense this deep in a restricted forest late at night. They approached cautiously, their adrenaline now overriding their earlier fear. The smoke smelled dry, acrid, and oddly mineral, like burnt sulfur. Leo reached the front door, a crude slab of warped wood hanging loosely on one hinge. He pushed it open, raising his flashlight. The cabin was empty. The single room was dominated by a fireplace choked with gray, cold ash. There were no coals, no heat source, and the hearth was clearly untouched for months. There was no furniture, no sleeping bag, no trace of human habitation, recent or otherwise. The air inside was freezing and stale. He swung the light up the chimney flue. It was cold and clear. There was no fire, and had been none before.
Jake backed out slowly. "Leo, the smoke!" They turned back to the chimney. The thin column of smoke was gone. The air above the cabin was perfectly clear, indistinguishable from the silent, freezing night sky. The deception was brief, but profound. They had seen smoke, smelled fire, and then pulled into an empty, ancient husk. Leo's flashlight beam, sweeping the floor one last time, caught a small object tucked beneath a warped floorboard near the fireplace. It was a book, roughly the size of a hand, bound in thick, dark, scuffed leather. It had no title, and the leather felt unnaturally dry and warm to the touch. Driven by a terrible, foolish curiosity, Leo snatched it up. As he did, a sound, a sharp, almost imperceptible tap-tap-tap, came from the shadows behind the rear wall. They both heard it. It wasn't the sound of a small animal. It was focused, deliberate, and waiting. "We have to go," Jake pleaded, his voice cracking. They didn't argue. With the cold certainty that they were standing in a place that watched and consumed, they bolted from the cabin, heading back toward the direction of their camp, the strange leather book clutched tightly in Leo's hand. They ran blindly, the cold air tearing at their lungs, the image of the empty cabin and the memory of the tapping sound, pushing them faster than panic alone. Leo clutched the dry, warm leather book tightly, the object feeling heavier with every stride. Suddenly, without warning, Leo's pace was violently arrested. He didn't trip. His momentum was instantly pulled backward and downwards by an unseen force. A noose, a thick, icy pressure, seized his ankle with the abrupt, unforgiving finality of a steel trap. He went down hard, the flashlight flying from his grip and tumbling into the underbrush, plunging the woods into absolute, suffocating darkness. Leo screamed, a sound of shock and immediate pain, as he was violently dragged backward through the dense pine needles and frozen earth. The dragging was swift, brutal, and powerful, pulling him deeper into the forest at impossible speed. His body slammed into roots and rocks, snapping sounds audible over his cries. "Jake!" Leo yelled, diving after the light source. He scrambled frantically through the darkness, following the terrible receding sound of his friend's body being scraped across the ground. Jake found the fallen flashlight and snatched it up. The beam illuminated the scene. Leo's body was a mess of torn clothes and bleeding abrasions, his face contorted in agony. The invisible force binding him was too strong to fight. Driven by sheer terror, Jake dropped to his knees, frantically searching for the binding point. His hand passed through freezing air until he felt it. A thick, icy, rope-like tension clamped around Leo's left ankle, vibrating slightly. He drew his heavy hunting knife, and focusing on the taut, invisible cord, he brought the blade down. The knife struck the binding with a high, sharp whang, a metallic sound that defied the soft, cold air. The invisible cord snapped instantly, releasing Leo. Jake dragged his friend backward toward a dense cluster of trees. Leo was whimpering, conscious but severely injured. His clothes shredded, a deep gash bleeding heavily above his eye. "We have to go, now," Jake gasped, trying to pull Leo to his feet. But before Jake could lift him, the air around them condensed. The cold mineral scent that had been near the cabin returned, immediate and overwhelming. Leo suddenly went rigid in Jake's grasp. An unseen, powerful force seized him by the neck and hair. Leo's eyes went wide, reflecting a paralyzing, final terror. He was lifted swiftly into the air, not slowly, but with the rapid vertical jerk of a puppet yanked by a string. He hung suspended for a terrible moment, completely soundless. Then, with a hideous, invisible finality, his neck twisted and his head snapped sideways. It was a single, devastating, traumatic blow. His body went instantly limp, and he dropped to the ground, a catastrophic, silent collapse. Jake didn't scream. The horror was too immense, too sudden, too absolute. He stood paralyzed, witnessing the soundless, malicious nature that had just executed his friend. He was utterly alone. Jake didn't wait to check Leo's pulse. The immediate, brutal finality of the invisible violence was all the diagnosis he needed. He was paralyzed for one agonizing, silent second, staring at Leo's twisted form and the unnatural stillness of the air above him. Then, instinct took over. Dropping the hunting knife, Jake turned and fled. He ran blindly, fueled by pure, shrieking adrenaline and the constant crushing knowledge that the predator was still behind him, formless and lethal. He ran into the dense, suffocating blackness of the deep forest, gave way to the slightly looser growth near the clearing. He burst into the small circle of light cast by the camp lanterns, gasping, collapsing on the frozen earth near the newly built fire pit. Adam and Charlie were tightening the last tent ropes, the pleasant crackle of their small fire providing a deceptive sense of safety. They turned instantly at the sound of the hysterical collapse. "Jake, what the hell happened to you?" Charlie yelled, rushing forward.
Jake tried to speak, but only ragged, choking sobs and meaningless stuttered sounds escaped his throat. He clawed at Adam's arm, his eyes wide and vacant, reflecting the absolute trauma he had just witnessed.
"Leo, gone!"
Jake finally managed, the words tearing out of him.
It lifted him! No rope! No! It just snapped him!"
Adam grabbed Jake by the shoulders, shaking him once, hard, trying to anchor him to reality. "Slow down. Where's Leo? Did you fall? What snapped?"
The air lifted him! I cut the rope, but then it took him up! It was invisible, Adam! It killed him right in front of me!"
Jake dissolved into profound, hysterical crying, rocking back and forth uncontrollably. His thick jacket was ripped, his hands scraped raw, and he was trembling violently from cold and shock. Charlie, who had been listening with dawning horror, looked toward the oppressive blackness of the tree line. An animal? Maybe a rogue hunter? A trap?
"It wasn't a trap, Charlie! I saw it! It was nothing! It was air! He's back there! He's dead!"
Jake screamed the final terrible truth. Adam looked from Jake's utterly broken state to the dense, silent forest. He was a man who lived by evidence and structural facts, but the complete collapse of Jake's mind was in itself compelling evidence. Jake was suffering from severe, undeniable trauma. "We are going back," Adam stated, his voice flat and controlled, betraying no emotion. "Charlie, grab the satellite phone and the strongest lantern. Jake, you need to show us exactly where." Charlie hesitated, looking genuinely terrified. "Adam, we call the police. We do not go back into that." "We go back," Adam cut him off. "If he's right, the police will never find him in this darkness, and if he's wrong, we have a missing person to find. We need proof." Adam quickly armed himself, strapping a heavy professional-grade pry bar to his pack and grabbing the largest first aid kit. Jake, despite his profound terror, nodded faintly. He was incapable of being left alone, and the need to verify the horrifying reality of Leo's fate provided a terrible, twisted purpose. They moved quickly and quietly away from the relative safety of the campfire. The walk back was agonizingly slow, guided by Jake's panicked, disjointed directions. Adam led the way, his large professional flashlight cutting a narrow, insufficient path through the suffocating darkness of the forest. The cold here was intense, accompanied by the low, constant hum of tension that Adam recognized as the presence's proximity. Charlie trailed behind, clutching the satellite phone, his eyes darting frantically between the trees. Finally, Jake pointed a trembling finger toward a gap in the growth. The cabin! It's just past here!" They entered the small clearing, but the sight that greeted them wasn't Leo's body on the ground. The entity had reorganized its display. Leo was suspended from a thick, low-hanging branch of an oak tree near the dilapidated cabin. He was hanging unnaturally high, his feet several feet above the ground. He was clearly dead, his posture horribly contorted. The severity of the damage was obvious even in the weak light. The injury to his neck was catastrophic, confirming Jake's hysterical account of the sudden, brutal blow. The sight of their friend suspended like a terrible trophy was horrifying, an absolute confirmation of the violence they faced. Charlie let out a choking cry, dropping the satellite phone into the underbrush. He stumbled back against the cabin wall, paralyzed by shock. Adam stood frozen, the beam of his flashlight locked on Leo's suspended body. The metallic, mineral scent of the unseen entity was overwhelming in the small clearing. He took a single slow step toward the tree, his mind racing to find a logical explanation, a wire, a hidden crane, anything. There was nothing. The truth was as terrible as Jake described. "It's real," Adam whispered, the technical term for the entity irrelevant now. Jake, who had collapsed onto his knees at the confirmation of his trauma, was shaking violently. He looked from Leo's body to Adam's face, seeking direction. It was in that moment of horrified confirmation that the attack resumed. There was no warning, no gust of wind, only the abrupt, deafening crack of bone and air displacement. Jake was seized by the invisible force. Adam and Charlie watched in horror as their remaining friend was violently snatched into the air, rising vertically with sickening speed toward the heavy branch above. Jake didn't scream. He let out a single sharp gasp, a sound of sheer, overwhelming physical shock, and his body went rigid.
The force delivered the same instantaneous, devastating, traumatic blow to the neck and head that had killed Leo. Jake's body went instantly limp, the paralysis complete. He hung suspended for a moment in the terrible space beneath Leo, a second, equally horrifying trophy. Then, with a casual, final violence, the entity released its grip. Jake's body dropped heavily to the frozen earth, a final sickening thud, confirming his death. Adam and Charlie stood, the sole horrified witnesses to the complete psychological and physical annihilation of their friends. The silence of the forest returned, profound and triumphant.
The sight of Jake's silent, immediate execution snapped Adam's paralysis. This was no longer a structural failure, it was a high-velocity hunt. He didn't waste time checking pulses. He grabbed Charlie by the collar and hauled him away from the horror in the clearing. "Run! Now!" Adam roared, shoving Charlie hard toward the direction of the camp. Charlie, already on the brink of collapse, bolted, his fear transforming into pure, frantic speed. Adam followed, turning his flashlight off to avoid giving the entity a fixed target, relying solely on the faint ambient light filtering through the dense pines. The pursuit was instantaneous. The entity didn't follow the game trail. It moved through the deep woods with a terrifying, non-physical speed that annihilated the distance between them. Adam heard the chase behind them, no longer the heavy footsteps, but a sound far more chilling, a shrieking, non-human whine, high-pitched and metallic, like stressed steel tearing at immense velocity. It was the sound of a predator moving without friction or obstacle. "It's right behind us," Charlie screamed, stumbling through a patch of thorns. "Don't look back! Keep moving!" Adam countered, pushing him forward. He could feel the temperature dropping violently just yards behind him, the freezing pressure marking the entity's boundary. Then, the chase became physical. Adam felt a sudden, brutal, invisible impact on his left shoulder. It wasn't a push, it was a tearing force, like being struck by a razor-sharp, freezing, blunt object. The pain was blinding, white-hot, ripping through his thick thermal layers and sinking deep into the muscle. He gasped, falling to one knee, the flashlight clattering into the pine needles. He scrambled back up, blood immediately soaking his left sleeve. The wound was deep, bleeding freely, but the shock of the freezing contact had cauterized the immediate pain into a throbbing, searing ache. The entity had physically struck him, a horrifying confirmation that this was not merely a psychological haunting. "Charlie, go!" Adam yelled, shoving his friend with his good arm. He ignored the paralyzing pain, tasting the metallic tang of his own blood in his mouth. The shriek behind them intensified, the high-pitched metallic sound closing in once more. It was playing with them, hurting them. Adam knew the entity's speed meant they had no chance of outrunning it. Survival depended on reaching their camp gear, the satellite phone, the truck keys, the fire pit. Adam staggered through the underbrush. The relentless, freezing pain in his shoulder fueled a savage desperation. He forced himself to use the pain, to push past the shock, recognizing that this was the structural failure of his own body and he had to fight the collapse. He could hear Charlie's terrified, ragged breaths just ahead of him, the only anchor left in the terrifying black chaos of the forest. The shrill, non-human shriek was right behind them, its icy breath a promise of a third, final, catastrophic execution. Adam and Charlie burst into the clearing, the small, civilized campfire now looking like a pathetic, inadequate defense against the overwhelming darkness they brought with them. The relentless, high-pitched shriek of the entity was deafening behind the tree line, its icy presence pressing into the clearing. "The keys! The truck!" Adam gasped, his voice ragged, gripping his bleeding shoulder. They didn't get 5 feet toward the parked pickup. The unseen entity delivered its final, devastating display of malice and power. The small campfire immediately exploded. The flames, which had been merrily licking the dry pine, roared violently, leaping instantly toward the dry nylon of the 2 tents. The canvas ignited with a sudden, savage whoosh. Within seconds, the entire campsite was engulfed in a ferocious, chaotic inferno. The heat was immediate and intense, a terrifying counterpoint to the paralyzing cold the entity radiated. The tents became columns of liquid fire, melting their contents into smoking heaps. Supplies, the fuel canisters, the cooking gear, the heavy packs were consumed in the raging, roaring chaos. The dense smoke rolled upward, choking the air and mixing with the steam of Adam's own rapidly freezing blood. The fire provided terrible illumination. The clearing was now lit by the chaotic orange-red glow of destruction, throwing the surrounding pines into sharp, dancing relief. "We have to move, now!" Charlie screamed, shielding his face from the intense heat. Adam, despite the debilitating pain in his wounded shoulder, forced his mind back to the technical reality of escape. The raging fire was an environmental hazard, but it was also a distraction. The raw, kinetic energy of the blaze seemed to disrupt the entity's cold, calculated pursuit. They bolted toward the truck, its black metal gleaming under the terrible light of the burning camp. The shriek of the entity intensified, now sounding maddened and furious. The high, metallic whine mingling horribly with the destructive roar of the flames. The entity fought back using the environment. As Adam reached the driver's side door, a massive, ancient pine branch, not burning but heavy and thick, snapped violently from a nearby tree, crashing down directly in front of the truck's grill, blocking their immediate exit path. To the passenger side. Go! Adam shoved Charlie toward the other door.
He fungled desperately with his keys, his left hand useless, his right hand slippery with blood. The entity was closing in again. The intense, sickening cold rushed the back of the truck, threatening to freeze the very door handle. Adam slammed the key into the lock, the cold metal burning his fingertips. He felt the freezing, paralyzing pressure of the unseen force pressing against his back, trying to pin him against the door. He gave one final savage wrench of the key and pulled the heavy door open, collapsing half in, half out of the cabin. Charlie had already scrambled inside the passenger seat. They were exposed, surrounded by the towering, consuming flames of their broken camp, but they were in the final stage of escape. Adam slammed the driver's side door shut, the latch locking with a final desperate click. He wrenched the key, the engine roaring instantly to life, a perfect mechanical miracle that offered temporary salvation. He didn't bother with the headlights. The blinding, savage light of their burning campsite was enough. He threw the transmission into reverse, flooring the pedal. The massive branch across the hood splintered as he backed over it. He spun the truck violently, tearing out of the clearing, the roar of the engine battling the triumphant, raging sound of the inferno consuming their abandoned supplies. He drove blind, fast and hard, tearing down the choked, unpaved road they had traveled the night before. They didn't speak. The interior of the cab was bathed in the red, frantic glow of the distant fire, visible through the rear window for several minutes. Charlie was huddled against the passenger door, his face slack with profound, unrecoverable shock. He was alive, but irrevocably broken. Finally, they reached the main interstate, the solid, predictable lines of civilization. Adam pulled over, killed the engine, and let the blessed neutral hum of passing traffic wash over them. The silence in the cab was immense, broken only by their ragged breathing. Adam looked down at his left arm. The deep wound on his shoulder was still bleeding sluggishly, the torn fabric of his shirt glued to the muscle by frozen blood. It was a searing, physical proof of the night's unseen violence. The unseen killer had left a very visible scar. "Leo, Jake,"
Charlie whispered, his voice thin and hollow, a sound of utter defeat. Adam closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the seat. He was a man who lived by blueprints and predictable laws. This entity, the cold, silent murderer, had destroyed every structural rule he lived by. He knew what the failure was now. It wasn't the silence, the cold, or the fear. It was the book, the small, dry leather volume Leo had foolishly snatched from the ruins of the cabin. The entity wasn't just hunting them. It was trying to recover the artifact that Jake had mentioned. The structural failure of the forest was that it was guarding something it had lost. They were the only survivors, the only two left to carry the physical scar and the terrible unspoken knowledge. The memory of the high-pitched metallic shriek and the freezing violence would be permanent fixtures in the comfortable walls of their future. Some structural failures are irreversible. Adam finally looked at Charlie, whose eyes were vacant, staring at a place miles away. He knew Charlie was beyond repair, but he wasn't. Adam pulled his bleeding arm across his chest. He was hurt, scared, and scarred, but he was alive. That forest is still sitting out there. If I gave you the coordinates, would you dare spend one night inside those woods? Tell me in the comments, should the Phixer ever go back behind that wall? Adam started the engine, pulling slowly back onto the interstate, leaving the silence, the fire, and the broken bodies far behind. He knew one terrifying thing for certain. His next job was always waiting.